In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you guys how I created a winter themed Genshin Impact render using Blender and Photoshop for an art contest on Twitter. Now, apparently, I couldn't win those primo gems to flex on everybody, but I surely hope that you take away something new from this video and learn something. Also, stick around till the end of the video where I'll be announcing something new, and who knows, you might find something exciting there. Now, let's not stretch this too long and get right into it. So here we are in Blender, and I've laid out all the important references that I needed from the game in this neat little piece of software called PureRef. I get asked about this a lot, so I just wanted to get that out of the way first. Also, if you want to break this scene down yourself or use anything from it in your own scenes, I have a link down below in the description to where you can buy it. It's okay if you can't afford it, I'll be sharing most of what I did here anyway, so just sit back and enjoy. Now, as you may notice, I mostly have the front views of the statue that I'm gonna be creating. This is because the way I imagined the final render should be like does not display any of the details on the backside. So it's a good idea to plan out your scenes in your head using a reference or just by drawing a concept art so that you don't spend too much time moving the camera around for nice angles. Also, one more thing is that I'm not gonna go over too much of the technical details of the process and instead just give you a general idea of the workflow. This might not be good for beginners looking to recreate a scene from a tutorial, but trust me, it will be some invaluable info for later when you're working on your own scenes. You can always search up specific technical problems that you encounter while making something, but it is hard to teach the creative side of things with step-by-step tutorials. Anyway, to start off, I modeled the basic foundation of the statue by using a cylinder as the starting mesh. This let me quickly adjust the shape and add loop cuts wherever I needed them for extra details. You also want to make sure that your proportions are relatively similar to the reference. More accurate adjustments can be made later after you're done making the basic outline. For the bottom piece of the statue, I added a circle and deleted half of it, which let me add a mirror modifier on it to avoid repeating the same things twice. For the pointed shape in the front, it's as simple as using proportional editing with the proper fall-off curve and then grabbing a vertex and pulling it out. Then we can keep extruding it up and scaling it to make the design. For the curly design of the metal guards here, I just added a Bezier curve and deleted the points. Then I used this draw curve tool here and drew a very ugly sketch using my mouse. Since my sister was participating in this contest as well, she was using the drawing tablet and I had no other option but to just use my mouse for the whole project, except for a bit of the fiddly sculpting part, which I'll get into later. Now, once I had my basic sketch in the form of a curve, I deleted half of it and used a mirror modifier to duplicate it to the other side. Then with a few adjustments, I had a good shape to start with. I did the same thing again to continue the design on the backside, after which we can just simply add a mirror modifier to make the whole loop. But before that, let's convert it into a mesh and fill it with a single face. Now, because of the hideous topology of this mesh, it is absolutely unusable for any deformations, so I took the longest route and just tried to make everything quads myself. You can avoid this tedious process if you just use a plane and make the shape instead of a curve, but as you can probably tell by now, this is why my videos take so long to make. Anyway, after that, I just added a circle curve object and also added a curve modifier to the shape and selected the newly created circle curve as the curve object in the modifier. Once you find the right axis to deform with the curve, you can also add the mirror modifier to complete the other half. And after you're happy with how it looks, you can apply the mirror and curve modifiers and add a solidify modifier to finish it off. Make sure you duplicate it and keep it in a hidden collection in case you need it in the future if you mess things up. Next, I tidied up the statue by adding subsurf and bevel on the mesh. You can have the bevel amount a high number with the limit method set to weight, and then you can select an edge and press Ctrl E, edge bevel weight, and then gently drag your mouse away from the selected edge loop. This way, depending on how far you drag, you can set varying amounts of bevel on your mesh. I did a similar thing to the base of the statue as well before moving on to the next step. So next up, I had to work on Barbatos or Venti, who is standing up here. Luckily, I found a model of Venti online, which I imported into Blender to work with. You can search up on YouTube if you're curious of where to get this model and how to import it. It's actually pretty simple. I deleted all the extra stuff like his vision and other accessories that I didn't need for my model. Then using the rig that came with the model, I quickly posed him in a similar way as the statue. It wasn't 100% resemblance with the statue pose, which I realized only after I finished the whole statue, so I really couldn't bother tweaking it further at that time. Now, once I had his pose, I deleted all the shape keys for his facial animations so that I could apply the armature modifier and consolidate his pose. After I got that done, I copied him from this project and pasted him into my main project. A lot of proportions had to be manipulated for it to look remotely similar to the reference, such as Venti's height, the height of the statue, etc. Moving on, I decided to work on the clothes next. Started off with a simple cube which I worked on in an iterative process. I also deleted more parts of his original mesh which were sticking out out of the new cloth mesh just to tidy things up while I work on it. I also deleted the entire lower half of his body so that I had better control over it. It won't pose a problem anyway since it won't be visible, so it's for the best that we get rid of it. I finally got a base mesh that looked like this, nothing super fancy. I also wasn't too worried about the shoulder intersection since they were going to get covered by the top part of the cloak. Speaking of which, I decided to make that next. It was again just a simple cube that I tweaked around. I also extruded the bottom part to let it hang like this. Then there was more tweaking, smoothing, and adding modifiers like the subsurf and solidify to finally end up with something that looks good enough. After a bit more refining, I went ahead and did the wings. I started off with a plane that extruded up to the front, similar to what we have in the reference. Again, you want to do it step by step, so start off with the base mesh first and slowly, with each new iteration, keep adding more details and filter the mesh. I also took this chance to quickly set up a ground plane and the camera so that I know which details would be visible. I did plan on doing an animation or at least multiple angles, but I don't have access to my main PC right now and I'm just working with a makeshift setup at the moment. So yeah, one frame for now. I paused on Venti for a while because I didn't have my tablet yet for sculpting, so in the meantime, I decided to add the details on the statue. Some of these were pretty simple, which could just be made using a plane. For some of the complex ones, I duplicated part of the mesh from the statue and made it a separate object where I then cut the pattern that I want using the knife tool and delete the remaining part of the mesh. This way, I was able to not have to worry about the topology as the shape was already cylindrical. Now it was time to work on Venti again. I started off with his cloak, which was probably the most visible part of his body. I used dynamic topology set to constant detail with a resolution of 40 and then hit detail flood fill to subdivide the mesh. Then I smoothed everything out. To sculpt the creases on the cloth, I tried out a bunch of brushes to see what would look best, and I ended up using the draw sharp brush because it felt the most natural. I'm not an expert sculptor by any chance, so it took me a lot of fiddling around to get something that I liked. I also used the cloth brush for some extra details and the grab brush to make major changes to the shape. There was more refining behind the scenes which I didn't record, but I guess you get the idea. The next part was the wings, which I sculpted in a similar way. I think this was the newest part for me as I haven't made any wings so far in Blender. Fortunately, it was only a statue, so I didn't need to be extremely precise with it. I worked on the silhouette first and slowly started adding the creases for the details. It took me a lot of undoing and redoing to get it looking just right, but I used the same brush as the cloth for the creases and I just made some strokes with the clay strips brush to finish it off. The hood was also pretty similar. It didn't need too many details, so all I really did was just use the cloth brush to deform it a bit, and I refined it using the draw sharp brush for some more flair. Of course, none of this is really necessary if you're going for a single frame render, as most of these details won't be visible anyway. But I'm planning on making a nice animation and a couple of more renders with different angles, so doing these extra steps really gave me that opportunity. Since most of the statue was already finished, I felt like doing the ground next. So I basically subdivided and solidified it and then made these random extrusions at the edge and also randomized the shape a bit. Then I appended some free stone brushes I got off of BlendSwap, which is my favorite free sculpting brushes pack for Blender so far. I used them to quickly add a whole lot of details on the ground. I've used them in the past for my runestone scene as well, which you can watch in case you're curious about how you can use them in different settings. Next, I added a massive plane to the background and sculpted some hills for the mountains in the back. Since these lack detail in the silhouette and look too smooth, I also sculpted a smaller hill using the brush pack on a plane and then duplicated it all over the background with a few tweaks wherever it was looking too repetitive. Now I thought the scene was pretty much complete in terms of the models, so I wanted to add some lighting to it to see which models would need better texturing and the ones that I can just get away by just slapping on a seamless texture. So I added a huge cube covering the entire scene and then added a principal volume shader to the volume input of the material output for its material. Pretty simple, nothing too crazy so far. I also added an HDRI that I had lying around to add some lighting to preview the fog and adjusted its settings. Now once I had a rough idea, I started off by unwrapping the ground first for texturing it in Substance Painter. Even though it seems like a very complex object, it really is just a cube. So you can unwrap it like a normal cube, putting seams wherever there are hard edges, and it should work just fine. I also always use this add-on called UVPackMaster 2 for packing my UV islands. It just packs your UV islands in the most efficient way possible, making your life a whole lot easier. I'll have a link to this add-on down below if you're interested to buy it. Now this is basically how I unwrap the statue as well, and I don't want to bore you to death by showing you every every one of the pieces. So just keep in mind the key principles of UV unwrapping, which are to just add seams to the hard edges to avoid the stretching of the textures and to hide the seams in places which are out of the camera's view. Always use a UV or color grid to preview what your unwrapping looks like and see if there's any stretching. Usually when you do everything right and it still gets stretched, it is because you need to apply the scale on your objects before hitting the unwrap button. And finally, once you're done unwrapping your objects, make sure your textile density is consistent, or basically that your UV islands are averaged out in size so that each part of the object receives a similar resolution of the textures rather than some parts being high and others being low resolution. After the unwrapping stage was done, I wanted to make the textures for the ground because it was fairly simple. I downloaded textures off of Texture Haven and CC0 textures and imported them into Substance Painter. It took me a fair bit of experimenting to see what would work the best, and at the end I settled on something like this, which was this grayish type of stone texture. It was achieved through 4 types of textures, and I mostly used the smart masks and generators that came packed with substance to first add some grunge and then a dirt layer in the engraved parts and also a lighter texture on the top for some edge wear. Next was the statue, which was more than just exporting and slapping a texture on top. I tried to take care of the masks in Blender by creating vertex paints to be later used in Substance Painter to create the ID maps. So I put similar vertex colors for parts that needed the same textures and different colors for anything I wasn't super sure about just yet. Next step was naming everything accordingly and adding the prefix _low by using the batch renaming feature in Blender. Then I also created another duplicate collection but replaced the _low suffix to _high. This will let us get some really clean bakes because it will take into account each separate object for baking even though they might have the same material. I mainly use the default smart materials to quickly add some base textures to the models and save some time. I also had to manually paint some parts of the model which I forgot to make masks of, but it was fairly quick as well because I was able to locate the islands on the 2D view. I also painted the extra details on the statue like the bumps and the emissive parts. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. After adding some imperfections like edge wear, dirt and rust, I exported the textures and set up the material in Blender. Everything was the same as any other PBR material that you'd set up normally, except the emission, which I set up by connecting the emissive color to an emission shader and then adding it to the principal shader by using an add shader. This way we can control the intensity of the emission easily. Now if you're wondering about this emissive column, I tried different ways of recreating it, but the best way to make this in this case was to just use an emissive plane. The material looks something like this, where we have a gradient texture hooked up to a color ramp to control the fall off, and then this controls the strength of an emission shader with the color set to blue. I also mixed it with a transparent shader and used the color ramp to control the factor so that the black parts use the top input, that is the transparent shader, and the white parts use the emission shader. You can also put a math node set to multiply after the color ramp to control the intensity further. For the health in the background, I simply used one of the textures that I downloaded for the ground because they were almost imperceptible anyway. Now moving on, I decided to dive a little bit into the lighting. I decided to keep the HDRI that I added for preview but decrease its intensity. I added a sun lamp as the key light. This is where most beginners would just call it done or maybe just add 1 or 2 random lights somewhere, but let me tell you, it is okay to do workarounds, especially for still images since you never see what's actually going on and only care about the final output. I always heavily base my lighting off of this principle, which lets me explore possibilities beyond what you'd consider physically accurate, which is only having one sun lamp to do all the work. Anyway, enough blabbering, let me show you everything that I did. I firstly added a plane with a noise texture controlling the transparency. I plan on shining light through this plane so that there are some extra shadows making it feel like clouds, even though you may feel that it is unnecessary and it wouldn't make much difference anyway. It's these little things that make a render look more than just a fake image. Even though you don't notice exactly what's going on, you just feel that it's all in place. People mostly notice what's wrong with an image instead of what is right, so doing these extra steps slowly eliminates that. Again, what I did here is that I duplicated this plane a few times and used area lights behind them to get some extra shadows on the ground. Now for this sphere's lighting, I made use of the layer weight node's Fresnel output to get that outline mask. I also connected it to a color ramp to change the whites to blue. Then I simply used it to drive the color of an emission shader and added it to the main shader. And once that was done, I added an extra area light to emphasize certain parts like the top of the statue. Everything was coming together now, but then I realized that I haven't added any snow. So I tried adding snow to the objects to just using masks in their materials first, and it worked, but I wasn't totally satisfied with how it looked. So I ended up adding another type of snow, but this time they were separate objects. Instead of doing it manually, I found an add-on called Real Snow, which basically does it automatically for you and even sets up all the materials. So that's what I used. For the ground, I just selected the parts where I wanted snow manually and then turn on selected faces in the add-on before hitting add snow. snow. For the statue, I relied on the automatic mask and it did a fantastic job. After making some final tweaks and adjustments like adding trees in the background using transparent planes, adding some extra fog depositing just below the mountain tops and other details like that, I decided that it was time to do the final render and move on to the post-processing part in Photoshop. I also rendered out the Misc paths, which I'll use in Photoshop to do a hacky compositing and put the clouds in the background. You'll see that in just a moment. But first, let's just start off by converting our layer into a smart object and then going to filter, camera raw filter. This way we can tweak the settings later if we wish to. We'll start off by mainly adjusting the exposure, contrast and shadows. Next comes a very important part where you can tweak the colors however you like. This is a very powerful post-processing tool for most cases. However, in my case it's basically a monotonous image, so there aren't a lot of colors that we need to worry about here. Now after that, I just added some vignette and we're done with the basic processing. I didn't make the snow in Blender as it would just be a waste of time since I decided that my submission would be a single frame render because of the time crunch, so I did it in Photoshop instead. I watched a tutorial on how to make it and it was fairly simple. Just search up on YouTube how to make snow in Photoshop and follow any one of the top tutorials. They're all amazing. After getting the snow done, I just used some cloud brushes and stamped them like so. Then I brought in the Misc paths that I said I rendered earlier and I used it to create a black and white mask and selected the white areas using the color range tool. Then I created a mask using this selection and voila! You've got your clouds in the background just like that. I used soft light for the blending mode and played around with the fill till I liked what I saw. I also added more clouds where it made sense and tweaked them some more. I felt like the image needed some more epicness, so what I thought of doing was looking for some God rays overlay images on Google and found one that I liked. I brought it inside Photoshop and positioned it so that it looked like it was coming from the clouds. I made a mask and erased the parts where I didn't need it. To add some more oomph, for a lack of better words, I added some subtler and punchier glow layers using the soft light and the linear dodge blending modes. I also painted some fake shadows on the ground and set it to soft light to add some extra ambient occlusion. I did the same to the hills at the back so that they're just a tiny bit slightly extra visible, making it look very awesome in my opinion. Then I made the scene a little more contrasty by darkening some of the clouds and then brightening the clouds where the sunlight seemed to shine through. I also drew some highlights on the snow and the statue for some separation. Then as a final little flare, I added a distorted glow to this part of the statue and also added the floating orbs in the aura around the statue. And finally, that was basically all I did to create the statue of the Seven in the Dragon Spine region of Genshin Impact using Blender, Substance Painter and Photoshop. For your reference, this is what the same place looked like in the game, and this is what I guess you can call my recreation. So I hope you learned something from this video and or found it entertaining. If you did, then make sure you show your appreciation by liking this video and commenting your thoughts down below. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on the few videos that I upload once in an eternity. Now if you've made it this far in the video, I want to give you a little surprise. But before that, I want to announce quickly that I've relaunched my Patreon page and revamped the tiers quite a bit. I guess the tiers aren't as profitable for you guys as it used to be, but this really sheds off a lot of load from my back of making those monthly packages, and now I can focus on putting out occasional packages which will be of a higher quality. Anyway, we have 5 tiers now ranging from $1 to $50, and you get awesome perks at each level to make it worth your money. For the ones who just want to show their support, you can go for the $1 tier and get access to the behind the scenes content and sneak peeks of ongoing projects. At the second tier, you get early access to all of my future uploads, and you also get some constructive criticism on your artwork. The $10 tier gets you exclusive tutorials and project files and also a 50% discount on all of my products on Gumroad. Then there's the $25 tier where you can make custom requests for exclusive content and also get all of my products for absolutely free of cost. What's more is that you also get an exclusive renderized mug after 3 months of support, which isn't and won't be available anywhere except for Patreon. And finally, we have the $50 tier, which is just for people who want to give more, and as a bonus you also get more exclusive merchandise such as hoodies, t-shirts, mugs and posters. I've been working on improving the channel and looking for ways to improve my content further in 2021, and I think this is also a step in the right direction so that I can ensure my financial freedom in a few years. But all of that aside, it's now time for your gift for making it this far. You can use the discount code RREarlySquad100 for a 100% discount on the scene on Gumroad, so that's basically free. This code will be applicable only for the first 100 people, so make sure you redeem it as soon as possible. Now with all of that said and done, that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.